Over 100 years ago, a national movement took place that became known as the Celtic Revival. It turned to Ireland's past to create a future sense of Irish identity, embracing many areas of Irish life: literature, painting, sport, and the Irish language. At the heart of the revival were some remarkable individuals. This is the story of one of them. The GAA is a passion of mine, but I've often had some questions specifically around Michael Cusack, the person who founded the GAA in the 19th century. Michael Cusack's view that hurling should be a sport held dear by all Irish people was an infectious idea. In founding the GAA, it became clear he had set in motion a sporting and cultural revolution unlike anything seen before in Ireland. So who was Michael Cusack? Michael was born to Irish-speaking parents in impoverished circumstances in 1847 at the height of the Great Famine. Michael grew up here at the edge of the Burren in County Clare.
The context of Michael Cusack's early life was one of poverty. Poverty which was endemic in the area which he came from in not just the years directly after the famine, but the decades after that famine.
Well, Michael Cusack grew up in a gaeltacht area here in the Burren. It was a pretty simple lifestyle. His father was a herdsman, and of course there was no schools in this area, so he didn't have to go to school. So his young life was spent helping his father around the farm, looking after the animals and doing some fishing, until eventually he did go to school at the age of 11. He was quite a bright pupil, and he very quickly became a senior monitor, which was a teacher's helper at the time.
The life of the young Michael Cusack was to be transformed by education and by his own ambitions.
He benefited, first of all, from the spread of national school education across Ireland in the decades after the Great Famine. And he was so bright that he was taken into that system as a teacher. After a period of years through the 1860s, teaching in near Gorton, County Galway, Michael Cusack got restless. He was restless by nature, and he kept a restlessness through his life. And he then moved to work in a series of schools across the elite Irish secondary school system.
Cusack not only taught at these elite schools, he also became passionate about the sports played at them: athletics, rugby and cricket. And he came to believe that sport was a vital part of education.
His interest in sport was really wide-ranging, and his participation in sport was really wide-ranging. He was interested in athletics, he's interested in rugby, he's interested in cricket, he's interested in hurling. He plays all of these different games. He really is an all-rounder.
Michael Cusack married Margaret Woods from County Down in 1876. A year later, he set up an academy of his own in Dublin to prep students for civil service exams.
What that academy was, more than anything else, was a grind school to prepare students for doing the entrance exam into positions in the British Civil Service or into the constabulary.
Cusack's love of rugby led him to form his own rugby club in the academy he had established. He served as club secretary, trainer and captain. And in 1879, Cusack Academy Football Club gained affiliation to the Irish Rugby Football Union. It's hard to comprehend for me that only a few years prior to setting up the GAA, Cusack was so deeply involved in the IRFU.
When you read the newspapers of the late 1870s and early 1880s, you get kind of glimpses of Cusack's personality and kind of slivers of insight into how he played the game as well as how he viewed the game. For example, a Dublin newspaper report commented on his performance in a rugby game, saying everybody knows what Cusack is like in a scrum. The implication being that he was somewhat ferocious.
Cusack was not only passionate about sport, he was also a passionate nationalist. He determined to help revive the health of the Irish race by encouraging the growth of native sport. For Cusack, hurling in particular was a vital part of the Irish national identity. He claimed it was a principal instrument of culture among the most glorious people that ever lived in Ireland, the Fenians of ancient Erin.
Well, we know that Cusack played rugby as late as 1882, but he does become very disillusioned with what he begins to refer to as foreign games. And you're talking about rugby and cricket there in particular. He was influenced by his nationalism. He was influenced by his immersion in Irish language activities. But he's also influenced by his growing anger at what he regards as the snobbery of those who are controlling these foreign sports.
According to Cusack, the game was invented by the most sublimely energetic and warlike race the world has ever known.
The story of hurling is the story of a game which reaches so far back into Irish history that divining its origins are, of course, impossible. The story of the 1800s, though, is the story of the retreat, but not the disappearance of hurling. Hurling was absolutely affected by famine, absolutely affected by emigration. There was a view that there was a certain barbarism around hurling. The game had not modernised in the sense that there were not clubs in Ireland established to play hurling.
Cusack was a prolific and a gifted journalist. He used his writing skills to promote the idea of Gaelic sports at every opportunity.
He does, I suppose, marry his strong sense of cultural nationalism with a new strong sense of sporting nationalism. And he begins to write in very trenchant terms about the idea of there being native Irish sports and there being foreign or imperial sports. And Cusack was a vitriolic wordsmith. He was thunderous in his pronouncements. And what comes along with the increasing profile of sports and the growing interest in sports are newspapers that are willing to publish and keen to publish articles on sports. And he was a very prolific journalist.
It's really interesting to watch what Michael Cusack did in his newspaper columns. And what he did was evangelise for hurling. He tried to push the game to get it played again in areas where it had been lost or was no longer played.
The game is an exceedingly simple one. It matters not how large the field is, nor does it make much difference how many players there are. We ourselves hurled in a room, and we hurled when the goals were even a mile apart. We have played in the depths of the winter, when the snow lay deep on the ground, and we have played it under broiling July sun. Nay, we have even played it by moonlight.
With his nationalist sympathies increasing, in 1884, Michael Cusack urged the Irish people to take the management of their games into their own hands. He wrote he wanted to encourage and promote in every way every form of athletics that is peculiarly Irish, and to remove with one sweep everything that is foreign and iniquitous in the present system.
In the beginning of October 1884, Michael Cusack penned a letter to two newspapers at the time, the United Ireland and Irishman. And it was an anonymous letter, but there was no doubt at the time that it was penned by Cusack. And it was titled A Word on Irish Athletics. So in it, he outlined the issues as he saw it and the concerns that he had about the state of Irish athletics and our national pastimes. Towards the end of October, Cusack wrote another letter to the same two newspapers, and in it he issued an invitation to a meeting in a central location, that being Thurles in County Tipperary, and that meeting was called for the 1st of November 1884. 7 men attended that meeting. The attendees decided to invite 3 individuals to act as patrons of the new association. So they asked Archbishop Croke of Cashel, and they asked Michael Davitt of the Land League and Charles Stewart Parnell of the Irish Parliamentary Party. So I suppose they were covering all bases in the sense that they covered church, Land League and also politics.
Once the GAA had been established, the next goal was to spread the message. Cusack was an effective propagandist, but he was not alone. The first president of the new sporting organisation was a well-known athlete called Maurice Davin, who first codified hurling and later Gaelic football.
Davin was from a very, very different background, but again, very, very committed to the idea of native sports. But they have to begin to spread the gospel, and they have to begin to communicate this message of a need for a commitment to promoting this organisation of hurling and of football. And that involves a lot of travel. It involves a lot of practical advice on how these games should be played and what rules should be applied to these games.
What Michael Cusack and Maurice Davin essentially did in the 1880s was take this game from history and they squeezed it into a modern playing field. It was essentially Maurice Davin who wrote these modern rules and published them after a meeting on the 17th of January 1885. And Cusack then operated as an evangelist, spreading this game through his newspaper columns. So what Cusack did was he operated as some sort of an agony aunt. People could write into him and ask for clarification of the rules, and he would publish those clarifications in the paper, all the better to spread the game. Number two, he went around the country writing of hurling games and trying to develop a sense of momentum about it, and did it rather brilliantly.
According to Cusack, the GAA spread across the country like a prairie fire. Low membership fees and the fact that games were played on Sundays, up to now the traditional Sabbath day of rest, undoubtedly contributed to the success. The political credentials of the association were also impeccable, with many clubs named after nationalist heroes and martyrs. After just 18 months, there were more than 50,000 members and more than 400 affiliated clubs. To put that figure in perspective, at the time there were just 100 rugby clubs in the country, even though the IRFU had been established for more than 10 years.
Michael Cusack's capacity for propaganda was very simple. He set out a paradigm in which you were Irish or British in sporting terms. His notion was, you can come to us in the GAA and you can play Irish games, or you can identify with those games and they're British. Now, it's quite ironic that he himself had played those games that were so utterly associated with Britishness. But when he turned, he really turned.
Cusack was a propagandist. He was a propagandist with a specific cause, which was to celebrate and promote the native games, which was to look at the whole question of hurling, for example. But he's not just a propagandist. He's also a creator. We've got to distinguish between the idea of the revival of hurling and actually coming up with modern hurling as we know it now. And Cusack was giving a practical meaning to that.
In Cusack's mind, a good hurling match was like a city on fire, where the crackling of burning timber and the hissing of the flames swell into the roar of conflagration. We never heard sweeter music than that of the hurling field. Cusack especially took satisfaction in seeing women attending GAA matches, wearing gala attire to flash looks and smiles of approval on their rustic nights. Cusack claimed females were there in great force, not the wasp-waisted, artificial-chested young ladies of the promenade, but rather the fine, free and easy, full-hearted picture of health like mothers, daughters, sisters and aunts. Cusack, however, didn't actually want the ladies to partake in the sports he so adored, and he was very set in his traditional views.
In comes Julia White. Hand pass inside to Angela Walsh. This is it. Goal for Cork. That's it. Cork's 25th All-Ireland. Joy for Cork.
I wonder what Michael Cusack would have made of this. Michael Cusack was able to promote the new sporting organisation and its games with great energy and commitment. But from an early stage, it was also clear that he found it hard to work with other members.
It's very interesting when you look at Cusack's life. He had so much about him that was positive. If you read his journalism, for example, and you read nothing about his journalism on sport and you just read his columns on, for example, mathematics, or on balloon making, or on so many other aspects of life, you would just consider him extraordinarily erudite, well-read, very capable, to the point of being a genius in the scale of his knowledge. But he was a peculiar genius, and his capacity to turn, you know, it was really potent. I'll give you an example. He fell out with a man called J.H. Christian and the people who established the Irish Amateur Athletic Association in competition with the GAA. The IAA secretary then wrote to Cusack offering a truce, saying, you know, we can sort this out. Cusack wrote back and sent it to the papers at the same time. And the letter simply read, "Dear sir, I received your letter this morning and I burned it. Yours sincerely, Michael Cusack."
He was considered by many to be an extremely difficult person to deal with. In fact, he was branded as a dictator by those who knew him well. He was forceful and dogmatic in argument, and was known to carry a club with him as a matter of course. This intractability was to become more of a disadvantage as the relations within the GAA became more complex.
He actually proved himself to be quite an incompetent administrator, but he was not somebody who seemed capable of working in a group. And he frequently had run-ins with people. He was a bully, he was very vain, he drank to excess, he was a very, very difficult personality. So in that sense, when you're looking at the issues that arose and the controversies that arose at his time, at the beginning of the GAA, a lot of them were created as a result of his personality.
He was quite an odd individual, and he dressed even in the +4s, and he always carried a blackthorn stick, even around Dublin in the late 1880s. That was looked on as being a strange rig out.
So talk to us a little bit about this Cusack memorabilia. Well, this item is a blackthorn stick, which is not that unusual in itself, but the fact that it's significant for the GAA Museum is that this particular blackthorn stick belonged to Michael Cusack. Oh, right. And in any imagery that we have of Michael Cusack from the late 19th century, he's always seen with his trusty blackthorn stick by his side.
I hope he hasn't had to use it on anybody.
Well, we hope not.
In 1886, Cusack made the strategic error of criticising the Catholic clergy, who were increasingly active in the GAA, including Archbishop Croke. Archbishop Croke took issue with Cusack. The Archbishop was not only a senior member of the Catholic hierarchy, he was also a very influential figure in Irish society. For once, Cusack was faced with a formidable opponent who would not be easily intimidated. Both saw the massive potential of the GAA as a cultural movement, and they were soon locked in a battle for control.
They did not agree on a whole lot of different things. And there is a tendency to look back on the 1880s and to imagine that people who disagreed with the church simply went to ground and didn't fight back. And that's not true at all. Michael Cusack was more than happy to argue publicly with Croke, and did so repeatedly. And indeed, there were GAA conventions where priests and other members of the GAA who were ardent Republicans came to blows and fought each other and hurled abuse at each other, and did so in the press as well.
Archbishop Croke threatened to resign as a patron unless Michael Cusack was removed from any official role in the GAA. Soon after, Cusack lost his position as honorary secretary, less than 2 years after founding the GAA.
At the meeting to remove him in the summer of 1886, it's a very striking point that after the vote was recorded and it was voted that he'd be put out, there was a cheer in the room.
When James Joyce wrote Ulysses, he based one of his characters, the citizen, on Michael Cusack, and it was a very unflattering portrayal of the man.
I find the character of the citizen fascinating. What type of Irishman is represented by the character of the citizen?
He's a very bombastic character. He's blown up out of all proportion. And this is precisely what Joyce intended. It's those kind of very obvious traits of Cusack that Joyce goes for. The very loud voice, the big bushy beard, the blackthorn stick, and so on. And these, as you say, these are things that Cusack himself cultivated as being in some way representative of kind of an Irishness that he was interested in.
There's the man, says Joe, that made the Gaelic sports revival. There he is, sitting there. The champion of all Ireland at putting the 16-pound shot. What was your best throw, citizen? No bucklish, says the citizen, letting on to be modest.
He represents all the worst aspects, at least from Joyce's point of view, of what being Irish was all about at that time. He's very xenophobic. He doesn't like foreigners in most senses at all. And whether they're Jews or British people or whatever, it doesn't matter as far as he's concerned. He doesn't like them particularly.
After 1886, Michael Cusack became less of a central figure in the GAA. He lost his official position, and soon after, his personal life went into a sort of freefall. His wife died, his family life began to disintegrate, and he began to drink heavily. While he continued to teach and write articles for newspapers, his influence rapidly diminished.
I think in assessing Cusack's life, around from 1890 onwards, you have to understand the extraordinary turmoil of his private life. You have to understand, for example, the fact that his wife died of TB in 1890, and 6 months later, one of his daughters died. His other two daughters were sent to live with people in England and eventually joined convent. He had three sons, two of whom at least were taken into care, one of whom seems to have stayed with Michael Cusack. And Cusack himself appears to have suffered from episodic alcoholism through these years. It must be borne in mind that his significance to the Gaelic Athletic Association after 1890 is greatly diminished. He is not a significant player after 1890.
The tragedy for Cusack was that he was never again allowed to serve in any official capacity in the GAA up to his death in 1906.
In many respects, he can be seen as the father of modern hurling in Ireland. His legacy is also profound because it was his expression of concern about the ownership of Irish sport and native games that ultimately led to the establishment of the GAA. And the GAA became a phenomenally successful movement, not without its difficulties, but it became the most successful of the mass movements. And that's due in a large measure to the original energy and vision and dynamism of Cusack.
The legacy of Michael Cusack can be seen all across rural Ireland, in the clubs that are lit up by floodlights, that necklace of clubs that bejewel the countryside, where Gaelic games have never been more popular and have never had as many children in there. And I think if Michael Cusack looked at that club structure across Ireland, I think he would be profoundly proud and possibly even a little amazed at what had started in a very small way with just a handful of men in a room in a hotel in the middle of Tipperary in 1884, that it should have come to this.
Michael Cusack was a man of vision and passion. His nationalist ideals and desire for Irish people to create a clear and separate identity were influenced by the times he lived in. Like Lady Gregory, Douglas Hyde, and Harry Clark, Michael Cusack was driven by a fire in his blood. These revivalists wanted to forge an Irish identity that was rooted in the past but was ready for the future. Their influence remains with us today.